Now, two reasons that I kind of lost there. What we'll do is actually have a quick look at the replay. Watch replay. So let's watch what my opponent was doing. We'll finish off this stream tonight. I lost that pretty bad in the end. That was a big A-move final battle. But I just want to show you why I lost. Now, that was a 20-minute game. So let's see what my opponent was doing as opposed to what I was doing to finish up. Let's speed it up a bit. We can see that I'm building, my opponent's building, all well and good. We can see my opponent takes the early gas. That's the first thing that we'll take a look at when my opponent grabs gas. And you see, my opponent grabs gas here, and you can see that my unit is coming up here, my scouting unit. We've got a view on where we can see both people. Always good to look at your replays. So you can see my opponent walling off the front of his base. I'm walling off the front of my base. So far so good. We've got quite an identical start there. But you can see I'm not going gas. I was a little bit slow because I had to sort out my hotkeys. It's okay, I can explain why that was lost. Now, you saw in that final fight that basically my opponent had, welcome Bon Buclat, good to have you with us. My opponent had vultures, and I just forgot to build vultures. So you can see my opponent's vultures killed my medevacs. I killed my opponent's medevacs. My opponent had more medevacs, more units in general, but I think we'll see that as we go through the game. So I here, I'm just going to have a quick look at the questions. When should I expand? That's Like a Boss is pretty good at StarCraft. He's, so you should listen to him more than me. Where this was good, so you saw that I sent that early worker over, and you saw that I saw this gas. So I was thinking in the game that I was going to get Banshees. So gas is for two things. It's either it helps upgrade and expand your units and gets you more complicated stuff more quickly. You don't need gas if you're building barracks early on and building loads of marines. That's a very big simplification. So here, because I saw the gas, I reacted to that gas, and the way that I reacted to seeing that gas, you see my opponent loading up workers into that gas. Let's just see what my opponent did here. So my opponent, workers, and you can see here my opponent built a tech lab. Now, I didn't see that tech lab, but if I got my units, if I'd sent my units again to his front of the base, I would have seen that tech lab, and if I'd seen that tech lab, I would have probably thought marauders perhaps into something else. So this is why frequent scouting is really, really important in a really simplistic fashion. Going and having a look at what your opponent is doing, even if you lose the odd cheap unit here and there, that information is more valuable than losing a 50 mineral unit. Because if I'd seen that tech lab, I would have thought, probably still marauders. Could, of course, still have been going air. So to go air, you need a factory, starport. Gas is an indicator, maybe it's going to be air or some kind of more techie early game push, rather than just a barracks and lots of marines, which costs lots and lots of minerals, for example. So my reaction there was, do you know what, I'm going to build 2 barracks, and then I'm also going to build the engineering bay. Now what the engineering bay gives is the sentry tower, the missile turret. Now the missile turret is a detector, and that means that it can detect stealth units. Now a common play for some people, if they're just messing around, or in an early game, is kind of a play where you go for early Banshees. Now Banshees are a cloaked flying unit if you've not played StarCraft before, so if I get 2 cloak units into my opponent's base and he has no detection, if he or she has no way of revealing those Banshees, then it's kind of a free win. So it's cheesy to some, it is a strategy, it can work, but you can scout it and you can prevent it. So I thought here, I think my opponent might be going Banshee, so I'm going to make sure that I've got stuff to cover Banshee. The 2 barracks is, I don't have loads of gas. Now missile turrets don't need gas, engineering bay doesn't need gas. What I'm going to do is not build my gas so soon, even though I still had a gas there later than my opponent. I'm going to make sure I've got lots of marines ready. I'm going to make sure I have a turret. That way if a Banshee does come in, I can shoot down the Banshee and see it. So it's kind of that stone, paper, scissors we were talking about earlier. That was a reaction. Now my mistake was I should have followed up with another scout. I should have sent something to the front of this base. If I'd sawn that tech lab, that would have given me more info. Let's keep looking at my opponent here and see how they go. So we now see the first marauder coming out here around about this, what time are we at? Around about this 5-minute mark. At this stage of the game we can see my opponent has also gone for the early expand. Now on this map, I'm still learning the new maps. There's a map rotation in StarCraft every so often. On this map you can see that you start here and there's no real way that your opponent can get there unless they've got Air Force. Well, unless they go air. So you, on this map, basically can expand to the back of your base quickly and easily and not particularly you know, you'll be in no massive danger. So you see at the moment I'm kind of stockpiling minerals. I should have expanded at this point. My opponent is macroing well. They're trying to expand here, and they can do so very easily. You can see, look, unless I get through the front of my opponent's base, there's no way that I'm going to be able to attack this expansion. Welcome, Gavin. You find us just running through a StarCraft game we just played from a replay perspective. So we can see build. My opponent at the 6 minutes mark, fantastic, has managed to get that base up and is upgrading it to an orbital command. So that means that they can use cooldown mule. You might have seen me using quite a bit. Cooldown mule gives you a lot of minerals in a hurry, and it uses energy. You've got other things you can use there as well, but you upgrade to an orbital, so you can do those scanner sweeps. You can also do a scanner sweep for the energy that the orbital has to reveal bits of the map, check what's going on. You saw me do that at the very end of this game. You can already see that at this point my opponent's pushing 3 marauders. They've opened with marauders and they've expanded. So Lud asked the question, when should I expand? The answer I gave in the middle of the game when I was hurrying was when it's safe. Now, that's not really a very accurate answer. The answer really is welcome Crosshair, welcome Brunswick, good to have you with us as well. We're just doing a bit of new player friendly StarCraft, and I'm pretty much a newbie again myself, so this is not gold massive league play. This is making mistakes together and learning from them. So when is it safe to expand? So you can see that for this opponent here I was playing, what did they think? They thought, right, I'm on a map where this is a very specific map. I've not played this map before last night, but you can see that effectively you've got your walled-in expansion here, you've got your safe minerals, you start here, you've already walled off the front of your base as a Terran, and that will change with other races that you play. I know there are a few people here who have not played StarCraft before. Terrans can wall. Zergs, it's a little bit harder. Protoss, they can kind of, but not so much so. So on this base, for a Terran, because with your buildings you can effectively wall off in this manner, and of course with the supply depot you can see there, you can raise it up and raise it down. You put a bunch of units, you can see I walled off, not hugely effectively, but could have been a bit tighter, but with my supply depot and 2 barracks I walled off the front of my base. My opponent can obviously see my 2 barracks, and when my opponent saw my 2 barracks they knew what I was doing. So we see the push here with marauders. Down we go. And then we see the first engagement, and my opponent comes to the base and sees 2 barracks and thinks, okay, right, there might be some pressure. I end up pushing this off, but let's see what my opponent does to react. Now my opponent sees my 2 barracks, immediately throws down another 2 barracks. Let's just wind back a little bit. So part of it is this little game of kind of chess, this game of kind of stone, paper, scissors that we're talking about. When does my opponent throw these 2 barracks down? Just going to seek around a little bit. Okay, we see stuff flying around. Pause. No barracks so far. La 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 la. Okay, now let's see. Now we can see. Okay, so when that push goes out, my opponent hasn't even scouted the front of my base yet, but he's throwing down another 2 barracks. So I can't see that, obviously. As well, we see death of my unit in the middle of the map. Boom, 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 boom. I shouldn't have made 2 barracks there, 2 bunkers there. That was a bit of a waste. Then if we pause, I push back attack 1. My opponent's seeing what I'm up to. Now they're going into tech labs, so my opponent pressuring even more. But remember that because you're a Terran and you can move your buildings around, going into tech lab doesn't mean that it's stuck to that building. You can obviously lift off and put your buildings down, and then you can swap your buildings. So even if I've made a tech lab, it's not stuck to the barracks. I can move my factory onto the tech lab. I can move my starport onto the tech lab and switch things around here. That gives you the option, and hey to Brunswick as well, that gives you the option of putting up those tech buildings early. So I had the reactor. My original plan was to switch my starport onto the reactor, meaning that I could then build. Reactor basically means that you can build twice as many units at the same time. Tech lab means that you can build more sophisticated units and upgrades. That's the pretty much definition of those for a Terran. So with 3 tech labs, that's good. If I could have got into my opponent's base, or if I'd scanned or used an air unit, if I'd seen those tech labs, I would have probably thought, my opponent may well be building a big bunch of, could be air units, could be siege tanks. A lot of those things feed off tech labs quite a bunch. Meanwhile in the back we can see still no gas taken. It's only taking the second gas in his main this early, so has focused, having got the initial gas to go Marauder, built his tech labs, and then is taking more gas. So let's charge on. Let's see what my opponent's up to. You can see my second marauder comes back. We can see another bunch, just a single marauder. They've been rallied. See a whole other bunch of marauders flying on in. So it's currently just throwing marauders at me in the early game. Look in the top left. My opponent's broadly got a few more units than me. He's got a lot more units because I've only just expanded by this point. So I've been actually expanded, if you take a look at that, a good 5 minutes after my opponent. So already I'm on the back foot. I didn't expand as early as perhaps I could have done, and that meant I'm getting less units of resources. And by getting less units of resources, I'm going to be behind when it comes in a building race. Effectively, StarCraft, what can come down, it can come down to, as well as control and as well as good armies and good positioning and good plays, how quickly can you rebuild your army? If my army gets wiped out, do I have enough buildings to rebuild units quickly? Do I have enough resources to rebuild units quickly? Expanding gives you more resources. Having the buildings means you can reproduce the units more quickly, and then it comes down to individual control of armies and tactics, pretty much. But if you can't rebuild your units quickly, and if you don't have enough resources to build units, you're not going to be in a position where tactics kind of matter. So you can broadly speaking say that the tactics is micro control, or micro, and the building stuff quickly and making sure you've got a good economy is macro. So they're the two elements of game that you need to work on. Here I'm falling behind in macro. So we can see that, back to the game, I've expanded, don't even have full workers in my buildings here. Little pause, let's see what my opponent's up to. Let's just have a look at the bases. I'm on 3 barracks, you can see my 3rd barracks is going up there. I managed to tack into my factory. I've got 2 of those down, I'm cranking away my infantry upgrades. You see my opponent is macroed 6 barracks. And you've actually got reactors going up on a couple of those. We've got 3 tech lab barracks churning out marauder, just really rushing and rallying and pressuring. Now got pretty much full there, 2 more gases going up, and a 3rd. My opponent is expanding. This is what I was slow on doing. My opponent's already looking to take a 3rd. We can see that because my opponent, in terms of actual units on the table, my opponent is not hugely ahead of me. We can see my opponent, I've got more of an army on the table. So the ironic thing here is, if you look at this, if I'd actually pushed my opponent here, I would have won, or I would have done well. So it goes on to another thing of StarCraft. You can't just sit there with your army in the base. You need to use your army to its best potential. So if we look at this, my opponent's got a lot more workers than me, but my army is better than my opponent's. So my opponent's pushing with these 4 marauders. That's kind of all my opponent has. But my opponent also has the capacity and has units coming out. So if I'd pushed at this particular time, I could have done quite a lot of damage. But then, of course, my opponent would have thrown out only 3 or so marauders. 2 marauders? 2 marauders. 3 marauders at that point. So there was a point in this game where I had the bigger army, and I'm sitting here in my base turtling up and I'm not doing anything about it. Now, you can kind of win some games like that, but you need to try and, as a good player, getting in good habits. I should have taken this army out and done something with it. I should have pressured the front of the base. I should have taken this area back a bit earlier. There's only 4 marauders there. My army could have easily seen all of this off and done some damage. So my mistake here was sitting and not doing anything. I've got a siege tank. I've got a lot more units, 4 units in that bunker. This could have also pushed this off a lot earlier. And again, my opponent retreats all of this nice big army and then just takes his army home, because the reason is he's kind of seen what I do and don't have. Opponent's expanded and got that 3rd base. And we can see now that because my opponent's production is bigger than mine, look at how many units my opponent has. They've now suddenly got 30 to my comparatively small 15. So, because I didn't push at that point, because I haven't expanded quick enough, and because I haven't dealt with my macro and structures, obviously my opponent's going for a very big marine sort of infantry unit style here. And you can see there's no, and just look at the top there, you can see I went 2 labs probably a bit too early. I took 2 engineering bays too early. My opponent still hasn't even got 1-1, but they've got the 2 labs in place now. I spent my money in the early game too much on these. You can see I've actually just got my infantry weapons completing at this stage. So my opponent is early in the game invested into army, invested into expansion, and is not worried too much about me. I have got behind at this stage. You can see now we've got a double force difference here, and from here on it's going to snowball. There's only 9 minutes left in this game. So as we forward more, we can see that my opponent's economy, not spending it as quickly as they could. I'm keeping mine low, but I'm not generating as much income as my opponent is. So as we forwarded more, we can see now the upgrades are coming. My opponent's getting in a good position to push. Still hasn't even bothered going, little shenanigans here. You can see moving of buildings, getting starports onto reactors, switching a factory with a reactor, making sure the starport's got a reactor. So the observer, yep, an observer will reveal. There's also a scan for Terran. Absolutely right, Brunswick. Lud asks, how can you detect stealth units? Or set detectors, so there are detectors for each race. So a nice little switcheroo here. This is what I was talking about earlier in terms of switching Terran buildings around. You'll be able to drop this down here, and then this is where my opponent is. We'll probably see them drop that there. And now they're doing what I was trying to do, churn out medevacs. But the other thing that my opponent does very smartly, and I forgot about this Terran versus Terran, is they churn out the Vikings. Sorry. If you look at Vikings are great at killing air units in bulk, and then they can also land and turn into a little ground assault unit as well. They're not so good on the ground. But in a Terran versus Terran battle, my opponent has already seen that I am building barracks and infantry units as well. They've not looked at my base for a while. So here you can see I am churning out medevacs. I'm trying to churn out siege tanks. I didn't use my siege tanks to the greatest effect, but in a battle like that, my opponent's infantry overwhelmed my siege tanks before they really had a chance. If I'd put them up on high and had vision down low, I could have killed my opponent's infantry without my siege tanks dying. So this is a key thing in the final battle. I kind of miscontrolled myself a bit here. So forward, forward, forward. So my opponent has loads down there, doing a bunch. Now I'm doing cute drops here, but what I should have really been focusing on is macro. I have not really done the most. You can see if we just look at units, we've got broadly similar worker counts, but because my opponent's been macroing better, their army is a lot chunkier. I'm gone the tech read of siege tanks. My siege tanks could have still won the day here in that little battle. So you can see my drop comes in here, I score a little bit of damage, I run away. Across goes my dropship. It's going to get cute and dropping at the back. But you can see my opponent's taken another 3 barracks. So well, my opponent is on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 barracks. I'm only on 3. At this point, I think I just about decide to make a few more. So I'm behind on resources. I don't have enough production structures. I haven't expanded far enough, and my army is smaller. This is all going one way. My control would have to be phenomenally good to be able to win this final conflict. So if you take a look in the top right here, I'm sitting on 89 supply compared to my opponent who's almost got 150. So they've just got more units. When you take a look at the total supply, that's a good sign that my opponent is ahead. Always worth having a look in your replays at the resources. If your resources are really high, you're not spending them fast enough, you probably need more production. If your supply is too low or capped, then you're not allowing yourself to expand as quickly as you could. So let's watch the denouement, the end of this game. You can see I get cute with another drop. Now, as I said earlier, micro is all well and good, but it doesn't really matter that I'm killing off a few of his units, because he has so big of an army. So you can see when I had the right idea, but I should have done this a lot earlier in the game, and probably in a lot more strength. By this stage, even though I'm doing the drops, I'm going to kill a few of his workers here, but you can see that they have like close to 80 Marines, medivacs, and are building the Vikings. So it doesn't really matter. I do a bit of damage, I die, and then my opponent just thinks, right, you know what, I've got a massive army, I move out. Now if we take a look at my opponent's army state at this point, they have only 3 Vikings, but I believe that they're building some more. No, there's not even any more. If I'd killed those Vikings, it could have perhaps made the difference. I have a reasonable amount of siege tanks here, but my siege tanks are poorly positioned. So let's go to the final battle, see what happens here. My opponent's units at this point are only 1-1. They've only got 1-1 upgrades. My units are 1-2. I've actually got better damaging units, and I think that I might have the armour on the way. I had the armour on the way, but that wasn't going to finish in time. So effectively my opponent is supply capped, and I am a good 80 supply behind, so my opponent can't actually build any more units. They've got so many Marines at this 20-minute mark. So because they don't have any more stuff, they attack. Moves the army around, has done a double scan, and has seen the state of my army and my tanks. Now I didn't even have these tanks sieged up, so my opponent swings in around the right hand side, splits the army. Which is interesting, trying to do a little pincer movement here. Leaves, got a Thor there and some more units coming in reserve. Now even if I'd managed to win this, so opponent flying in from the top here, trying to take out my tanks, what I do is I've already moved my army around to push this away and try and deal with the threat on that side. So as that fight goes, you can see opponent has more medevacs. The vultures are picking off my medevacs, meaning that even though my units are doing more damage, they're not going to survive. I miss. Now if those tanks had been on the high ground, I could have perhaps defended this a little bit better, but my opponent would have still probably pushed in around this side. So my tanks were pretty much not too useful at this point, because my opponent had air superiority, because they had the vultures. So that's that. So loss for us, but hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight into the wonderful world of StarCraft. I lost painfully, but I know where I went wrong, so if I'm going to try and improve in future, what I should do is scout more, always something that's useful for everyone. I should build more production structures more early, and I should make sure that above all else I'm trying to expand. I need to make sure that I'm expanding in a timely fashion, because ultimately if you don't have resources, you can't build buildings and units. If you can't build buildings and units, you can't replace your army when it dies. If you can't replace your army, then it's a matter of pure control skill. But he who has a bigger army and bigger production is always going to be in a position where you can lose more units. If you don't have the units or the production or the resources, then it's always going to be a challenge catching up. You need the most miraculous control in the world. So that's a little introduction to StarCraft. Good to get back into it, and a little pointer in a very, very, very basic fashion. There are some fantastic streamers out there who have loads more skill than me and can probably explain in a better way than me. I've always been a Terran player, so there's a few things. Think about micro, the control and positioning of your units and groups. But firstly, think about macro. Are you expanding at the right time? Is it safe to do so? Are you scouting? Do you know roughly what your opponent's up to? Is it safe for you to expand? Do you have an idea of what your opponent's building and what you might need to build and how you might need to set yourself up to protect yourself? Do you know what your opponent's building, and does that give you an opportunity to damage them? There are some things called timing pushes, where if your opponent is doing a particular build, then you can build certain things or build in a certain way, build certain units and certain structures, and you can do them a lot of damage. So when we saw earlier in this game, for example, I saw that my opponent only had like 4 marauders and I had a bigger army. I could have hurt my opponent a lot if I just attacked, and I would have only known to attack if I A, knew what they were doing, and B, if I'd scouted. So being new to the game, or being new back to the game after a while, I need to just play. A lot of this is just playing and getting a feel for what's going on. But in the YouTube description, I can link you to a whole bunch of good streamers, a whole bunch of resources as well. We'll play a few more games and try and learn along together. A great starting point, go and look at day 9. Absolutely fantastic for learning to play StarCraft. So thank you so much for tuning in. This has been a little bit of a different evening. If you want to catch some more of this, we'll do some more of this. We do a lot of Hearthstone Heroes of the Storm. Check youtube.com/Failcraftcast, as you can see in the column on the left hand side. We go live Monday through Friday. We generally do Hearthstone for most of our streams, but we'll do some StarCraft too. You can see the times in the bottom left there. You can also follow us on Twitter at Failcraftcasts. All of our old videos on youtube.com/Failcraftcasts, and if you're watching on Twitch, pop us a follow. You can always find out when we go live there. If you're on YouTube, do like, subscribe, comment, let us know what we can do better. So thank you so much for tuning in. You're going to get a Hearthstone end screen. Been great to have you with us, and hopefully see you again soon. Take it easy.